Hi everyone, Ehsan Mary here, and together we'll be giving you some valuable information about one of the most underutilized visas within the E2 category called an E2 Essential Employee. And today I have the pleasure to be joined by U.S. Immigration Attorney Shruti Bali, and together we'll be giving you some valuable information about one of the most underutilized visas within the E2 category called an E2 Essential Employee. Good morning, Shruti. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning, Hassan. Good morning, everybody. So glad to be doing this.
Thank you. So first, let's give some context about the E2 visa. This is a treaty agreement between the US and certain countries only, and each country has negotiated their own treaty agreement with the US, and as citizens of each country receive their own specific E2 visas. Some countries receive a 5-year multiple entry visa, some countries 4, 3, 2 years. Some countries even receive a single entry visa valid for 3 months, meaning they have 3 months to use it to make an entry. Upon entry, they're going to receive a 2-year status. E2 is its own world. Some of the rules that apply to E2 visa are not similar to any other visas. And of course, there are some residency requirements. However, most of the focus on E2 visa is about the E2 investor. There isn't a lot of information about another subcategory, which is the E2 Essential Employee. And I'm so happy that today we'll be talking about it and providing this information to our audience. And something that's really important about is the keyword essential. So of course, as the title suggests, we have to show that their duties are essential to the success of the US company. But I will turn it over to you, Shruti. Please let us know who and what do you think is an E2 Essential Employee?
Thank you, Hassan. So as you mentioned, there are certain countries out there that have a treaty with the United States. Some of these countries at the top of my head, the UK, Australia, Canada, even some Asian countries like Thailand and Taiwan. What this treaty enables you to do is citizens of these countries can invest in a US business and then come here to then direct and develop that business. The key component being investing in a US business, which means it requires some sort of personal or business investment, which then allows you to come here. And as you mentioned, some of them are allowed to come here for 5 years, like citizens of Canada and the UK, and some of them get a visa for 3 months, such as citizens of Bangladesh. Now, when you come here to direct and develop a business, many a times a scenario develops where you need an employee, an essential employee from your country to come here and help you develop that business. This employee can either be in a supervisory or managerial position, such as a director of operations or maybe a general manager, someone in a higher level senior management position. Or it could be an employee that has very certain specific skills that your business really needs that cannot be replicated or easily found here in the United States, which makes it important for you to import, for the lack of a better word, such an employee from your home country. Now, speaking of that, a certain requirements that must be met before an employee qualifies as an E2 Essential Employee. He must be of the same nationality as the principal investor. So if the principal investor is Canadian, the employee must be Canadian. If the principal investor is Australian, the employee must be Australian. There are many a times when the principal investor has a dual nationality, like a French or a German citizen. In that case, what matters is what passport did that principal investor use to get his E2 visa, because then that is the nationality of the E2 employee. So for example, in the case of dual citizen of France and Germany, if he used his French passport to get that E2 visa, he can only bring in French citizens as E2 Essential Employees. So going back to reiterate a little bit more, the employee must be essential to the company. That means skills cannot be replicated or easily found here in the United States. Or he could be in a supervisory or a managerial position, coming here to develop and direct the company. He must be of the same nationality as the principal E2 investor. And just like the principal investor, the employee can bring in dependents, as in spouse and children under the age of 21, here to the US as a dependent with him.
And of course, since we mentioned that an investor can only bring in essential employees from their home country, that also means that if there are, let's say, 2 investors, each from another treaty country, each can bring in essential employees from their own home country.
The essential employee to come into the US, it is not necessary that the principal investor already have an E2 visa. The way the qualifications go is if the principal investor is in the US, they must be in E2 status. If they're outside of the US, they must be eligible to get E2 status. So a lot of the times the question comes up, does my boss need to have E2 status if I need to come in here as an essential employee? No, he or she does not, as long as they are eligible for E2 status. Of course, if they're in the US, they should already be in E2 status.
Thank you so much for that. And since we're talking about this as an employee, it's also notable to say that sometimes for a lot of work visa categories, it's the company that applies for you, not the individual. Can you just clarify this for us as well, that it is the E2 company applying for you, or are you the applicant as the employee?
You're being petitioned by your company 100% of the time. You are not self-applying. This is not one of those visas where you can apply for yourself or you can petition for yourself. You need a US entity to sponsor you.
Thank you so much. How about talking about who this essential employee can be, especially when it comes to sponsorships? It is not highly recommended to have an immediate relative, but in this essential employee, an immediate relative, it could be a child, it could be a brother or a sister. They can also apply to come as an essential employee, correct?
Why not, Ehsan? If the business really needs the services of this employee, I don't see how it matters if whether the person is an immediate relative or not. What really matters is if he or she has the skills, or if he or she was in a position of directing and developing the country back in their home country. They very well qualify for an E2. It does not matter if they're immediate relatives or not. In fact, in most family businesses, the E2 essential employee ends up being a family member because they were involved with the business back home and they would be involved in the same capacity coming to the United States.
And it's also very important to mention here that the E2 essential employee, when they're petitioning, they're saying that I'm required, this is my job description, I have to work for this US company. So their work authorization is going to be limited for that E2 employer, right? They cannot work anywhere else.
That is correct. Because they're being sponsored by the US entity only, they're only authorized to work with the US entity when they come into the United States. Also, just like the E2 investor, they are also limited every time they enter the United States to be given a 2-year status only, regardless of the visa validity on their passport. So even if they have a 5-year, 4-year, 3-year visa, 3-month visa, every time they enter the United States, they're only allowed to stay here for up to 2 years. And of course, they can always depart and then re-enter and reset the clock. When they enter, they can enter for 2 years at a time and to work with a US petitioning company. It's like any other employment-based visa.
Also, one of the questions that I get a lot, and I think it's a misconception, that people think that they have to apply for an essential employee at the same time as the E2 investor is applying. Just like you said, there doesn't even have to be an E2 principal investor. But I was speaking to someone recently that was saying, well, this E2 investor got their visa 3 years ago. Can they add me now? What do you think about that, Shruti?
Absolutely. If they now develop the need to have an employee come in and take care of the business or take care of the company function that they are now looking to hire for, as long as they continue to qualify as an E2 principal investor, they can bring in an essential employee, regardless of how much time has passed since they've gotten their E2 visa. Or even if they don't have an E2 visa and they are still abroad, the E2 essential employee can really be sponsored at any time.
So yes, I've seen examples of companies running for several years and all of a sudden they've developed this need and a new position was created and they need that specific skills and they had to bring in essential employees from their home country. So thank you so much for clarifying that. One thing that I really like talking about is that E2, you can apply it either if you're inside the US, if you've been in the US for more than 90 days and you end up having a new intent, you can apply for a change of status inside the US, or you can apply for an E2 visa from outside the US. Again, a lot of the time this is covered when you're applying as an investor, but I think we should also bring some clarity into an essential employee could also apply for E2 status directly from inside the US. It doesn't always have to go through the consulate. Is that right?
That is correct, Ehsan. So just like the principal E2 investor, the same rules apply for E2 essential employees as well. If they're outside of the US, there are 2 ways to apply for an E2 essential employee status, or one way is to apply for within a change of status within the US, where the E2 essential employee is already in the US in another non-immigrant status, say an F1 or a B1, B2, and the company realizes that they have a need for this person. They developed a special program, and this foreign national has the skills to really develop that program. So in that case, they would be applying for a change of status within the United States. At that time, the application would be made to USCIS. The pros of applying with USCIS is they do not have to depart the country to file for a change of status. They can opt for something called premium processing. By paying an additional fee of $2,805, they can get a response in 15 business days to their application. The cons of applying for within the United States is you get 2-year E2 status. They do not get a visa that allows them to travel internationally. They cannot depart the country while the application is pending or even after the application is approved. And every 2 years before their status expires, they must apply for an extension. option. The other way of applying for an E2 essential employee visa is through your consulate in your home country. It also, little
So
known
you
fact,
touched up
it
something
need not
very
be
important
a
here, and this is where
consulate
you
in
used
your home
the key
country. You
word.
can also apply at a consulate in a third country, in a country that's accepting third country nationals, where pros of applying for a visa at the consulate is that you get, in most cases, you get a multiple entry visa, which enables you to travel back and forth from the United States as many times as you like. The cons of applying at the consulate is there is no such thing as premium processing. Most consulates have a lengthy review processing time, which unfortunately they must abide by before their application comes for processing for visa.
So let's also open a parenthesis here. One of the exceptions that sets E2 apart from most other visas is when you do a change of status and you leave the country. If this was, let's say, an O1 status, that you changed your status, let's say from F1 to O1, or was it an L1, you can take that USCIS approval generally, apply for a visa stamp. But when it comes to E2, again, most of the time what is covered for the E2 investor is if you apply for a change of status and you leave the US, the entire case has to be refiled at the consulate as if this is the first time. They need to interview you, and then you are subject to approval or maybe denial. And can you please talk to us about if this is the same rule that applies to the essential employees if they do change of
Yes.
status?
So here's how the E2 differs from other non-immigrant visas. In other non-immigrant visas, such as the H1B or the O1 or the L1, once USCIS approves your case, it is just a matter of formality to go to the consulate and get your visa stamped in your passport and coming back in. The E2, unlike other visas, is governed by the State Department, which means that when you apply for a visa at the consulate has the authority, and in most cases, it does adjudicate your case all over again because it is not bound by the USCIS decision in any way, because it is originally under the umbrella of the State Department as opposed to other visas, which is why when clients come in and they want to file a change of status with USCIS, we always need to advise them that, hey, you can do that. That's perfectly acceptable. If you ever want to travel back and you want to come back in, you have to get that visa stamped in your passport, and it's going to be like a brand new application all over again because the State Department, or rather the consulate, is going to adjudicate that application. You have to submit the whole entire application again in most cases because they want to see everything from scratch and make that decision for you.
Very well. I think it's a good time to also bring in the topic of dependents. Of course, as every visa, how it works when you're applying for a visa and your dependents are with you, they will receive dependent visas and be able to come to the United States with you. One of my favorite things about E2 visa is the open work authorization that the spouse receives. So while the E2 applicant's work authorization is limited to the entity only, their spouse has an open work authorization. They can work anywhere they want, have multiple employers, have their own business. That is a very big perk. Now, of course, the E2 essential employee's spouse receives the same benefits that an E2 investors would receive. But I want to focus on, let's say you are a student in the US, you did a change of status to E2 essential employee. Your dependents, you have spouse and children that are outside the US, and now you want to bring them, but the case was not filed at the consulate. How can someone that has applied for a change of status but has dependents outside the US bring those dependents here?
Well, in that case, Hassan, they can always go to the consulate and apply for an E2 visa. The fact that their spouse filed for a change of status within the United States has an E2 approval is enough for most consulates to issue a dependent E2 visa to spouses and children under the age of 21 so they can accompany them to the United States and stay here as their dependent.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things that I really enjoy about E2 visa is that there are no term limits. Yes, it does not automatically lead to any kind of permanent residency. Your intent is always non-immigrant, but you can renew it, extend it indefinitely as long as the business is successful and profitable and it's growing. Can you please confirm, is that the same rule that applies for the E2 essential employee? Can you keep renewing it, or are there term limits for that?
There are no term limits. You can keep renewing the E2 essential employee visa for as long as the company continues to need you and for as long as you continue to have the skills or the ability to come and function in the way that they need you. As long as they continue to need your skills, or as long as you continue to act in a supervisory or managerial position, you can keep renewing that E2 essential employee visa. There are no term limits.
There is another component of E2 visa that I really enjoy, and I feel like it's another area of E2, especially E2 essential employee, that is not covered much, is the ability to put you on the path to that EB1C green card. While E2 is a non-immigrant intent itself, but would you like to talk to us a little bit about how an E2, especially an E2 essential employee who transferred as a manager or an executive, could also get to that path?
Not just an E2 essential employee, but even an E2 principal investor who has been in a managerial or executive capacity at a foreign entity abroad for 1 year and then gets transferred over to take over the same managerial or supervisory capacity here in the United United States, they can qualify for an EB1C. There is a misconception that you must transfer from the E2 first to an L1A and only then you get qualified for an EB1C. That is actually not correct. There is no need to go the L1A route. You can directly go from E2 status and apply for a green card under the EB1C category as long as you meet the qualifications of an EB1C, which is executive or managerial capacity back in your foreign country and similar capacity here in the United States. As long as you meet the qualifications of EB1C, you do not need to go from E2 to L1A. You can directly go from E2 and apply for a green card.
Absolutely. This is very fascinating. I find a lot of the people very surprised to hear this.
I've had many times clients come and tell me that, oh, but my lawyer told me I have to go transfer to L1A first. And I always have to tell them, no, you don't have to. You can directly try from E2 to an EB1C without having to transfer first.
Let's pick Canada as an example, who receives a 5-year multiple entry visa versus an L1 visa for a new office would be issued as a 1-year visa. And they have 1 year to start creating jobs right away in order to even apply for an L1 extension. They need some jobs, they need some revenues. While with the E2, they have that confidence that, okay, for the next 5 years, I have this visa. And whenever after 1 year of operation, I can get to those numbers, I can still get to that EB1C. So thank you so much for covering that for us. And Shruti, you and I each have a case study to do as well today. Very excited to go over that. Would you like to go start with yours?
Absolutely. We had an interesting scenario a few years ago where this foreign national, he decided to first try the L1A route because he had a foreign entity back in his home country that established a foreign entity here in the US. He tried the L1A new office route and he got a 16-page RFE where they requested everything under the sun. So we decided to change course and try the E2 route for him. When he wanted to go for the E2 principal investor route, when we started digging a little more, we realized that the investment was not his personal investment, but actually the investment from his company abroad. Also, when you look at the ownership of the E2 US company, it turned out that the US company entity was owned by the foreign entity, which was in turn then owned by a bunch of foreign nationals from that country. When all of this came to light, in that case, we realized that maybe the principal investor route may not be the best option for him, and we should instead try the essential employee route. Because for two reasons. A, the US entity was not owned by him personally, it was actually owned by the foreign entity, which in turn was owned by him in some part. Secondly, the investment that happened into the US entity was completely from the foreign company. It was not his personal investment. It was for both of these reasons where the essential employee route really came forth for us. It really came out for us and it really came in his favor, and he was able to come to the United States not as a principal investor, which is what he initially wanted to do, but as an essential employee. And of course, he was able to bring his spouse with him. He was able to bring his 3 little children with him. His spouse got a work permit where she was allowed to work for anyone that she wanted to. Another thing that I'd like to mention, which I did not mention before, is that spouses of E2 visa holders, principal investor or essential employee, no longer actually need to apply for a work permit. This changed back in January of 2022, where it was decided by a court case that they actually no longer need to apply for a work permit to get work authorization. Their visa and their passport, the spouse's visa and their passport, is proof of their work authorization. So when they enter the US, you have to make sure that your I-94 gets designated as E2S, which basically stands for E2 spouse. That is proof of your work authorization. That alone qualifies you to go to the Social Security office and get an SSN, which enables you to work wherever and however you like. You can even open your own company and you need not necessarily work for anyone in that scenario. So in any case, in his case, he went from trying for the L1 to E2 principal investor, and eventually it is the essential employee route that really worked out for him because of the particular scenarios of this case. So what I'm trying to get at is if you have not made a personal investment in a US entity, if your US entity is not owned personally by you, but by a foreign entity, which in part is owned by you, or it's not even owned by you, but citizens of that country, there are still options open for you. It is not the end of the road. The E2 essential employee can absolutely be a path through which you can come here to the United States.
That is very informative. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to also mention a case study. I particularly like this case because this was a business that had operation first in a foreign country, in a treaty country, and then they opened a US affiliate company. There was initially a principal investor, made a substantial investment into the US affiliate company, and of course brought his dependents with him. At some point, 2 years later, they basically had a position open. They had a very specific need for a very specific employee. And this is a business that specializes in smart home automation services and provides solutions to make everyday life easy for homeowners, for builders and architects. Some of these services are centralized audio and video systems, automated window treatment, lighting solutions, security systems, home theaters, and other services alike. So, for example, they help eliminate energy waste, checking or adjusting your home temperature remotely, video surveillance, etc. And the skills that were required for this position, for this essential employee, for building, designing, and installation of these specific systems, carrying the equipment, performing service work, operating special tools, and more importantly, possessing mandatory knowledge of the operating system. They had an operating system that was very unique to their own company. The essential employee that they had in mind was E2 investor's son. He had taken courses directly related to the company's products and also had worked for the foreign entity and the affiliate company for 2 years. So he had the required and invaluable experience. Therefore, the applicant was able to show the specialized nature of the skills, essentiality, and other relevant considerations for the E2 essential employee visa, and was able to demonstrate the necessary qualifications to contribute to the success of the US company. And this was particularly a success story because his son had aged out. He was 21 years old, therefore no longer a dependent, but they wanted to stay as a family, and this was a family business. And as soon as they found out about the E2 essential employee, because they were brainstorming and they wanted the son to maybe invest in another company, but at the same time had this specific need for this position, and they found out that their son is the most qualified person with all the certifications, the work history. So they applied, and he was so happy to receive his own independent 5-year E2 essential employee, and it was just so refreshing to see this happen. So Shruti, the last thing to cover here, maybe you and I are sharing all this information, and both of us are keep touching on the fact that not too much information about this is out there. This is more of a personal opinion. I'm just wondering, why do you think not a lot of information is out there about an essential employee?
Well, Ehsan, the biggest thing that comes into mind is because two of the biggest populations that send their foreign nationals to the US, India and China, do not have an E2 treaty with the United States, which is why this an E2 visa on a whole is not really well known in other parts of the world. That's the first thing that comes into mind. The second thing that comes into mind is the E2 most often is actually confused with the EB5, which is the green card equivalent of an E2. And where the confusion really comes from is that most often when I speak to potential clients, they always feel that there is actually a certain amount that need to be invested to qualify for an E2 visa, which is what kind of stops them and which is kind of discourages them from actually exploring this option. But it's actually not correct. There is no magic number out there where you need to invest a certain amount that automatically guarantees you for an E2, which you may have for in an EB5 scenario. I have done E2 cases for as less as $19,000 of investment and as much as $500,000. So again, the misinformation out there is also another reason why this visa is not very well known. Another reason I can think of is why the E2 route is not well known is again because you don't know that you can bring in employees. When people think of E2, they immediately think of investment. They immediately think of putting money into the US entity. They don't know that that is a component, but you can actually bring in employees as well. You need a component of investment, yes, but that is not all what the E2 is about. You can actually bring in your dependents. You can bring in your kids and your spouse under the age of 21. You can bring in employees who can help you run your business because you need them. So these are the few things that I can think of why the E2 is not well known.
In that same regard, I want to also bring something that you and I can briefly discuss is the number of essential employees that can one bring. Now, a lot of the people that have mentioned E2 essential employee are also under the impression that you can maybe get one or two because it's so difficult to get an essential employee. What do you think is the magic number? Is there a limit on how many essential employees one can bring?
There is no limit. Not that one I'm aware of, not that one that I see in the regulations. The regulations actually are absolutely silent as to how many employees you can bring, which means there is no limit on it as long as the company continues to need you, which means you cannot just bring in anyone you like. You actually have to justify the need to bring in somebody from your home country because at the end of the day, think about it, Ehsan. The reason for this treaty is because the United States wants you to come here, invest money here, and actually create US jobs. So that is the one thing that you do have to remember, that if you're bringing somebody from your home country as opposed to hiring in the US, you do have to justify the need. need to bring them in. Otherwise, it kind of goes against the whole purpose of the treaty in the first place. No magic number, but the need needs to be justified every single time you want to bring somebody in.
All right. Thank you so much, Shruti, for your time. Is there anything else you would like to add to this fascinating topic?
Ehsan, I think E2 visas, E2 status, investor, essential employees is just such a fantastic option out there that are available to foreign nationals of so many countries. Except, of course, like we talked about, the two biggest countries, which is India and China. But other than that, most other countries have this option for you to explore, for you to come here, for you to get a slice of the American dream, which is come here, explore your entrepreneurial spirit and work and develop, invest in a US company and create US jobs and get a slice of that American dream that everybody wants to get a part of.
I couldn't agree more with you. This is one of my favorite visas because there are many moving parts to it. Because, for example, you can be an entrepreneur. Of course, if you have a prior experience, it is very helpful to get that visa. But you could be someone that graduated college and has a specific degree and for the first time wants to create a company in the US, and you can be an entrepreneur without past experience, but with passion and a strong business plan, a clear plan for the next 5 years. And you can now take advantage of doing business in the United States and having basically the world available to you.
Ehsan, I also want to mention that not just somebody out of college. If you're already here on an E2 essential employee visa working for another company and you find another company who's owned by somebody of the same nationality as you, a change of employer is very much an option for you as well, by the way, just like any other visa where you qualify, such as the H-1B. A new employer can sponsor you and transfer your job from the old employer to the new one.
Very interesting. That also reminds me, you could be an essential employee in the US. Let's say for several years you're an employee, you've made an income, your spouse has worked and made an income, and now you have capital to start your own company. You can always change from an E2 essential employee, E2 investor as well.
Yes, or your company can sponsor you for a green card. The options are unlimited.
Absolutely. Yes. We love the E2 visa. Thank you so much again, Shruti, for your time. I appreciate you joining me. Thank you everyone for watching. Make sure to send us your questions and we'll be sure to answer them for you. And I look forward to seeing you with another informative video very soon. Thank you.